There is a group of people alive today who remember a world so different from this one that describing it to someone younger feels less like sharing a memory and more like describing a foreign country. A country where the neighborhood was a living organism, where silence meant safety, where your word, spoken out loud to another human being, was the only contract that mattered, where a handshake closed a deal that a lawyer would take 3 weeks to document today, where the people on your street knew your middle name, your grandmother's maiden name, and exactly how you took your coffee. These people are now in their 70s, 80s, and beyond. Some still drive, some still cook from scratch, some still send handwritten letters and feel a particular kind of irritation when someone responds to a letter with an email. Some still balance their checkbooks by hand at the kitchen table on the first of the month, because a ledger that adds up correctly is one of the few things in this world that can be fully trusted. And underneath all the modern conveniences they've adapted to, underneath the smartphones they use but do not entirely trust, underneath the streaming services and the online banking and the video calls with grandchildren, they carry something that cannot be downloaded, cannot be streamed, and cannot be taught in a classroom. They carry the psychological fingerprint of an era that built human beings differently. Not better, not worse. Differently. In ways that left specific marks on the nervous system. In ways that shaped how they handle money, how they handle loss, how they handle silence, how they handle commitment, how they handle the ordinary passage of an ordinary day. This is the psychology of people who grew up in the 1950s. The world they were born into. Let's start with the context, because without it, nothing else makes sense. If you grew up in the 1950s, you arrived in a world still exhaling from the greatest collective trauma in human history. Your parents had survived a depression that taught them hunger was not theoretical, not a concept, not something that happened to people in other countries or other centuries. Hunger was something that had lived in their own houses, in the faces of their own parents, in the particular way a family could sit down to dinner with less on the table than there had been the week before and say nothing about it, because saying something didn't make the food appear and made everything harder to bear. They had survived a world war that taught them death was not distant. The boys they had grown up with, the boys who had sat in the same classrooms and played on the same fields and danced at the same dances, had gone somewhere, and some of them had not come back. The ones who came back were changed in ways that the decade tried very hard to paper over with optimism and prosperity, and the steady construction of identical houses on identical streets in suburbs that had not existed 5 years before. And now, in this strange, sunlit decade, this decade of new cars and new appliances and new opportunities that genuinely had not existed for their parents, your parents were trying to do something that their own childhoods had never allowed them to do. They were trying to build something permanent, not just a house, not just a savings account, though those mattered more than you can imagine to people who remembered when savings accounts emptied overnight. They were trying to build a kind of life that felt solid, that had predictable rhythms, that could be counted on to continue. The houses going up in the new suburbs were small and nearly identical. The lawns were trimmed to the same length. The cars parked in the driveways gleamed with the same optimistic chrome, and the children running between those houses, including you, were being raised inside a very specific set of values: stability, conformity, respect, work. These weren't slogans on a poster. They weren't a philosophy someone had, chosen from a menu of alternatives. They were the operating system of daily life, installed by people who had learned the hard way what happens when stability fails, when the structures of ordinary life give way, when the world reveals itself to be far less solid than it had appeared. And they were installed in you before you were old enough to question them, before you had the language to ask why things were the way they were, before it occurred to you that things could be any other way. That installation process left marks that are still running in your nervous system today, patterns of thought that you didn't choose, but that chose you, that shaped the architecture of how you see the world and your place in it. The weight of the unspoken. Before we talk about what your childhood looked like from the outside, we need to talk about what it felt like from the inside. Because there was a particular emotional texture to growing up in the 1950s that nobody ever fully named. That you experienced every day of your childhood without having any framework for understanding it. That you simply absorbed the way children absorb everything, completely and without filter. You lived in a world where things were not discussed. Not the war. Not the specific things that happened in the war. The things your father or your uncle or your neighbor Mr. Hennessy had seen or done or survived or failed to survive intact. Those things existed somewhere behind the eyes of the men who carried them, visible sometimes in a particular stillness when a car backfired or when the news mentioned a country whose name had once meant something terrible. But they were never spoken. Not the money your father lost, not the specific arithmetic of what the depression had taken, the business that had failed, the house that had been given back to the bank, the years when there was not enough and everyone pretended there was. Those facts were filed somewhere in the family history labeled "before things." Got better, and you understood without being told that you were not to open that file. Not the cousin who drank too much. Not the neighbor whose marriage was visibly, audibly failing. Not the family down the street whose son had come back from Korea and was not quite right and sat on his porch some days, staring at something that wasn't there. Not the fear. Not the fear that lived in the back of your parents' eyes when they read the morning paper and saw words like atomic and Soviet and fallout. Not the specific terror of living in a decade when the full destructive capacity of human civilization had been demonstrated twice within recent memory and was now pointed from multiple directions at every city on Earth. That fear was real, and it was constant, and it was never, under any circumstances, acknowledged at the dinner table. These things existed. Everyone knew they existed. The silence around them was not ignorance. It was decision. A powerful social agreement had been made, silently, collectively, by an entire generation of adults who had already been through too much, that certain things would not be spoken aloud in front of the children. That the children would be given the gift, or perhaps the burden, of a surface that appeared smooth. And so you grew up in a house that was emotionally pressurized in a very specific way. A house where the official emotional temperature was pleasant and the actual emotional temperature was something else, something that you learned to read with a precision that would have impressed a meteorologist. You learned to read between the lines before you learned to read. You learned to interpret the set of your father's jaw at the dinner table. The particular way your mother closed a kitchen drawer, the difference between a drawer closed normally and a drawer closed in a way that meant something. The silences that lasted exactly one beat too long. The conversations that were happening in a room you weren't in that stopped just before you entered. The questions that were not asked and the answers that were not given, and the enormous amount of information that moved between adults through the medium of what they chose not to say. You became a reader of subtext so expert that you could diagnose the emotional weather of an entire room before you crossed the threshold. You knew before you reached the bottom of the stairs whether the evening was going to be easy or difficult. You knew which parent needed to be left alone and which one could be approached. You could hear the specific quality of silence that meant everything was fine and distinguish it from the specific quality of silence that meant something was being managed. That skill never left you. It deepened as you aged. It became so automatic that you don't notice yourself doing it anymore. It simply happens. The reading of a room, the calibration of the emotional temperature, the adjustment of your behavior in response. It's why you notice what people don't say more than what they do. It's why you can sit across from someone who is falling apart and sense it before a single word is spoken. It's why you sometimes know things about the people around you that they have not told you and could not explain how you know. You were trained in the unspoken language of human emotion by adults who communicated almost entirely in it. And you became fluent in that language so young that it feels like your native tongue. The neighborhood as universe. But let's step outside, because outside is where your real education happened. Think about the street you grew up on. Not just the physical details, though those matter. The particular slope of the sidewalk, the oak tree at the corner that had been there longer than any house on the block, the vacant lot 2 doors down where the older kids congregated, in a way that made the younger ones feel simultaneously excluded and drawn. The smell of someone's dinner that hits you at a specific point on your walk. Home from school every evening, always at the same spot, always at the same time, so reliably that you could have set a clock by it. Every house had a family in it that you knew. Not knew of. Knew. You knew what Mr. Callahan did for work, and roughly what that work paid. Not because anyone told you, but because you could read it in the car he drove and the trips they took in August and whether his kids got new school shoes every year or every other year. You knew that Mrs. Peterson baked on Thursdays and that the smell of her apple cake would drift 3 houses down the block by mid-afternoon, and that if you happened to be playing in the yard at the right moment, she might wave you over and hand you something wrapped in waxed paper. You knew which families went to which church, and you understood, without anyone explaining the sociology of it, that this information meant something about who they were and how they understood the world. You knew whose father had come back from the war different. You didn't have that word for it, but you knew. You knew that Mr. Doherty sometimes sat in his car in the driveway for a long time after he came home from work before he came inside. You knew that there were sounds from that house sometimes at night that weren't the normal sounds of a family. You knew that his kids didn't talk about him the way other kids talked about their fathers, not with that particular mixture of exasperation and pride, something quieter and more careful. The neighborhood wasn't a place you lived. It was a society you belonged to, a society with its own hierarchy and its own customs and its own history that went back further than your own memory. A society that had been there before you, and would be there after you, and that had a claim on you that was different from, and in some ways deeper than the claim of your own family. And that society had rules that were enforced not by laws, but by something far more powerful. Eyes. Every adult on your street had a claim on your behavior. This was not a metaphor or a social nicety. It was a real operational fact of daily life. If you threw a rock at a streetlight, Mrs. Romano would be on the phone to your mother before you reached the end of the block, and the conversation your mother would have with you when you walked through the door would begin. Not with "did you," but with "how could you?" If you used language you weren't supposed to use within earshot of any adult, Mr. Kowalski would stop whatever he was doing and look at you in a way that required no words and communicated everything. A look that your nervous system understood as clearly as a shout. A look that stopped whatever you were doing immediately and completely. You were not just your parents' child. You were the block's child, the neighborhood's child. You belonged to a network of adults who all considered themselves, without ever discussing it, to have both the right and the responsibility to shape your character. That created something that has almost entirely vanished from modern life. Communal accountability. You understood from the time you could walk that your behavior reflected not just on yourself, but on your family, your street, your parish, your town. The concept of private embarrassment did not exist because the concept of private behavior barely existed. Everything you did was, eventually, someone else's business. The neighborhood was a web, and every strand was connected, and when you vibrated one end of it, the other end vibrated too. Today that sounds oppressive. And sometimes it was. It meant you couldn't make mistakes invisibly. It meant that the gap between who you were at home and who you were in public was much narrower than it is for children today, because the public and the private overlapped so thoroughly in a neighborhood that knew you completely. It meant a certain loss of freedom, a certain weight of expectation. that could feel like a cage if you were someone who needed to be different from what the neighborhood expected. But psychologically, it created something else alongside the constraint. It created a profound sense of belonging, the deep, cellular, unambiguous knowledge that you were seen, not by a screen, not by an algorithm, not by a follower count, by actual human beings who knew your name and your parents' names and your grandparents' names, if your grandparents had lived on the same street, which they sometimes did, who had watched you grow up from a stage when you were small enough that the adults remembered it and could describe it back to you. You were embedded in a web of human connection so dense that loneliness, real loneliness, the existential loneliness of feeling unseen and unknown, was almost structurally impossible. You might be unpopular, you might be misunderstood, but you could not be invisible. That wiring still runs in you. It's why you know your neighbors when most people today know none of theirs. It's why you bring food when someone is sick, because you learned that this is what you do, not as a gesture, as a protocol, as a way that communities have always acknowledged to their members that they are not alone. It's why something in you still believes, at a level below ideology, that a community's health is everyone's responsibility, that you don't get to have a healthy street by minding only your own house, that the house next door is also, in some meaningful sense, yours to care about. You were shaped by a world where that wasn't philosophy. It was just how Tuesday worked. The Cold War inside the classroom. Now think about school. You walked in every morning and hung up your coat on a hook that had been assigned to you, not chosen, assigned, the same hook every day, your name written on a piece of tape above it. You walked to your desk, which had also been assigned. You sat down, you folded your hands. The teacher stood at the front of the room, and the day began. The teacher was always right. This was not a guideline. It was a law of nature, as reliable as gravity, as unquestioned as the arrangement of the solar system. The teacher knew things you did not know, and your job was to receive those things with gratitude and attention, and to demonstrate, through perfect or near-perfect recall, that you had received them. The teacher was addressed as Miss or Mr., followed by their last name. Always, without exception, without negotiation, from the first day of first grade to the last day of high school, and the idea of calling a teacher by their first name would have been so far outside the operational boundaries of your imagination that it simply would not have occurred to you, the way it doesn't occur to you to try to open a door by pushing on the hinges. Authority in your classroom was total and unquestioned, and it extended beyond the teacher. The principal was a figure of such absolute power that being sent to the principal's office was not a bureaucratic inconvenience. It was an event, a serious event, one with consequences that rippled outward from the school through the neighborhood and into your home in ways that were swift and certain and unpleasant. This structure taught you something about authority that you have carried ever since. Not blind obedience, not the inability to disagree, but a baseline respect for institutional hierarchy that came from genuine experience with institutions that, in your childhood, more or less worked. The school taught you. The teacher knew things. The structure produced outcomes. And so the structure was respected, not as an act of submission, but as an acknowledgement of function. But there was something else happening in that classroom that no one ever talked about directly, but everyone felt. The drills. You would be in the middle of a spelling lesson, or a geography quiz, or practicing your penmanship in the particular way that was required. The careful formation of each letter exactly as the example at the top of the page demonstrated, when the teacher would say two words that rearranged something in the air of the room. And every child in that classroom, aged 6 or 7 or 8 years old, would slide out of their chair in a motion so practiced it had become automatic, drop to their knees, tuck themselves under their desk, curl forward, and cover the back of their neck with their hands. This position, this specific configuration of a child's body folded underneath a piece of school furniture, was the answer that the United States government had developed to the question of what to do if an atomic bomb was dropped on your city. You were being taught, without anyone saying it outright, that the world could end, that the sky could open, that one day you might be sitting at your desk doing a geography quiz, and the last thing you would ever do was fold yourself small and put your hands over your neck and wait. The technology that had ended the war had not been put away. It had been multiplied, refined, pointed. And everyone in that classroom, teacher and children alike, lived with the knowledge of this, carried it under every ordinary activity, wore it as an invisible layer beneath the surface of a decade that officially presented itself as optimistic and prosperous and forward-looking. The adults around you maintained complete composure during these drills. The teacher's voice was calm. Her instructions were matter-of-fact. She said the words as she might say, "Take out your spelling books or pass your paper to the person behind you." And when the drill was over, when you climbed back into your chairs and your hands went back to your pencils, she returned to the spelling lesson or the geography quiz or the penmanship exercise as if nothing unusual had just occurred. As if preparing for nuclear annihilation was a perfectly normal interruption to a Tuesday morning and could be set aside without further discussion. And you learned something by watching her that went far, deeper than any duck and cover instruction. You learned how to function in the presence of fear. Not how to eliminate fear, not how to pretend it didn't exist, not how to talk about it, process it, name it, integrate it, or any of the other frameworks for handling difficult emotion that would be developed in subsequent decades. How to hold it in one hand and keep working with the other. How to feel something terrifying and continue anyway. How to let the ordinary rhythm of daily life proceed without requiring that the terrifying thing be resolved before you could participate in it. That is a psychological skill of enormous sophistication. It is not the same as suppression, though it looks like it from the outside. It is the practical capacity to tolerate ambiguity, to function under conditions that are not safe or guaranteed or resolved, to put your hands on what is directly in front of you and do the work regardless of what is hanging over everything. And it was built in you before. You were 10 years old by a generation of adults who had been practicing it their entire lives, who had learned it not in therapy, but in soup kitchens and foxholes, and the years-long suspension of normal life that war and depression produce, and who passed it on to you not through instruction but through demonstration. It's why you don't panic. It's why when something goes wrong, when there is bad news or a crisis or a situation that has no clear resolution, you get quiet rather than loud. You get still rather than frantic. You make a cup of coffee and you sit down and you look at what is actually in front of you, and you figure out what the next step is, not because you are not afraid, but because you learned a long time ago that being afraid is not a reason to stop moving. It's why people in crisis tend to call you because they know you will not fall apart. They have learned, through repeated experience, that you are the person who stays functional when functionality is most needed. And they are right, and they cannot always explain why they know this about you, but they know it. You were trained in the presence of existential anxiety, and you were trained to keep going anyway, and you have been doing it ever since. What fathers taught without saying anything. Let's talk about your father. If your father came back from the war at all, he came back changed in ways that were never described to you and that you were never supposed to ask about. The returning was the official story, the story that got told, the story that your family organized itself around. He came back, he got a job, he married your mother, or he had already married your mother before he left, and now he was home. And the family was together, and this was the outcome that everyone had hoped for, and the story was supposed to end there. With the returning, with the relief. But you knew, in the way children always know the things they are not supposed to know, that the man who came back was not exactly the same man who had left. There was something in him that had been there before the war and was not there after, and something in him that had not been there before and was very much thereafter, something that had no name in your household and that sat in the corners of rooms and the pauses in conversations and the specific way he sometimes went very far away while sitting perfectly still at the kitchen table. He went to work. This was the primary fact of his existence, the axis around which everything else organized. He left in the morning, sometimes before you were awake, often in the dark, always in the same way. The sounds of his departure as regular and reliable as the sounds of weather, the coffee cup on the counter, the particular sound of his shoes on the linoleum, the door, the car. He came home in the evening, at a time that was reliable enough that your mother could plan dinner around it, which she did, every day, because dinner was a scheduled event and his arrival was a scheduled event, and the two were connected by a reliability that was itself a form of love, the love that says you can count on me without ever using those words. He sat at the head of the table. He said grace, or he didn't. He ate what was in front of him without comment, because commenting on the food, unless the comment was positive, was not done. He read the paper. He watched the news. He went to bed. He got up and did it again. He did not discuss his feelings. This is perhaps the single most defining psychological feature of the men of his generation, and it is worth sitting with for a moment. Not to judge it, but to understand it. Not because he didn't have them. The idea that men of that generation didn't feel things is a simplification that flattens something much more complex. He had feelings. He had a rich and sometimes turbulent inner life that, had it been accessible to him or to anyone around him, might have told a very different story than the one that was publicly available. But the men of his generation had made an agreement, also unspoken, collective, arrived at without discussion, that feelings were weight, and weight slowed you down, and in the world they had just survived, being slow had very specific consequences. Weight got people killed. Feelings were, in the framework they had been given, a kind of indulgence that the circumstances of the previous 2 decades had not permitted, and that the circumstances of the current decade, however improved, did not seem to require. So your father taught you through action, through the sound of him leaving the house at 5:30 in the morning in the dark, not on one occasion, not on a few occasions, every day, every year, without complaint, without the need for acknowledgement, without requiring anyone to notice or appreciate or award him anything for the basic act of doing what he was supposed to do. Through the way he fixed the screen door himself on a Saturday rather than calling anyone, not because he couldn't afford to call someone, but because calling someone to do something you could do yourself was a category of behavior that would not have made sense to him, that would have required more explanation than the fixing itself. You watched him, and you learned a language that had no words, the language of showing up, of doing what needs to be done, of not requiring the world to acknowledge your effort before you made it, of understanding that integrity is not something you claim, it is something you demonstrate, day by day, action by action, in the small and mostly unobserved choices you make when no one is watching and when the outcome doesn't change whether or not you do the thing correctly. That language is still your first language. It's why you work the way you work, with a consistency and a reliability that people who grew up in later decades sometimes find hard to understand or to sustain themselves. It's why you sometimes have difficulty asking for help, not because you are proud, but because asking for help occupies a category in your psychological framework that is adjacent to not handling things. And not handling things is adjacent to categories that your nervous system does not like to visit. It's why something in you believes, at a level below conscious thought, that a person's worth is measured in what they do, not what they say, not what they feel, not what they intend, what they actually do day after day in the small and unspectacular practice of a life. That's not a flaw. It's not a limitation to be overcome with therapy and journaling and the vocabulary of contemporary psychology. It's a philosophy that was built into you by a man who earned it the hardest possible way in circumstances that required it, and it has served you for decades in ways that a softer psychology might not have. What mothers carried, and your mother. She ran an operation of extraordinary complexity every single day, and the world gave it no name, no wage, no professional recognition, and almost no acknowledgement except the acknowledgement of the thing continuing to function. The family fed, the house maintained, the social relationships of an entire household managed and navigated and sustained. Think about what that operation actually involved. The food planning, which was not the casual act it might be today, but a careful calculation of nutrition and budget, and what was available, and what the family would actually eat, and how to make the difference between those last two categories as small as possible. The money management, which happened without bank apps or spreadsheets, on paper, in columns, with the kind of careful arithmetic that knows that being wrong in one direction by a small margin has consequences. The social calendar of a household, which meant knowing which neighbor was having a hard time and might need a visit, which family event was coming that required preparation, which of the children had a situation at school that needed a parent's attention. She managed the emotional climate of every room she entered. She knew when your father needed to be left alone and when he needed to be drawn out, slowly, carefully, in the way that does not call attention to itself. She knew which of her children was struggling with something that hadn't been mentioned, and who could be asked about it directly, and who needed to be approached sideways, through an unrelated conversation that somehow arrived at the real thing. She knew when you were lying before you finished the sentence, not because she was suspicious, but because she had been paying attention to you with a focus and a consistency that you have probably never been paid by anyone since. She did all of this in a world that did not ask her opinion about how it should be run, did not value her intelligence publicly, gave her almost no choices about the shape of her own life, and offered her, as compensation for all of it, a social script about domesticity that she may or may not have found satisfying, and that she almost certainly never said out loud whether she did or didn't. What she modeled for you, whether she knew it or not, was a particular kind of strength, not the loud, assertive strength that gets celebrated now, the strength that announces itself, that takes up space, that requires an audience to validate it, something quieter and more durable, something that does not need to be seen to function. The strength of showing up every single day for the people who need you, without being asked, without being thanked, without keeping score, without even framing it to yourself as strength, because the people who possess this kind of strength rarely experience it as a virtue. They experience it as just what you do. You inherited that strength. It lives in the way you take care of people, without being asked, without waiting for someone to notice that care is needed and issue a request. It lives in the way you notice when someone is struggling before they announce it, before they've decided whether they're going to say anything, sometimes before they've fully acknowledged it to themselves. It lives in the way you understand, instinctively and completely, that love is not a feeling you declare. It's a practice you maintain. It's the accumulation of 1,000 small acts of attention and care that no one records and no one applauds, and that together constitute the actual substance of a relationship. That understanding is rarer than it sounds. And you have it. You have it because you watched it performed every day of your childhood by a woman who never once described it as anything. The radio in the living room and the television that changed everything. Think about the living room. In the early part of your childhood, the most important object in that room was not a screen. It was a piece of furniture, a real piece of furniture, something with weight and presence, and a cabinet that matched the other furniture in the room, with a speaker behind a cloth grill and a dial that glowed amber when you turned it on, and that warmed up slowly, the sound arriving like something waking from sleep, a crackling and then a clearing, and then the voice or the music or the story that you had gathered to hear. The radio. Every evening your family gathered around it. not sitting passively in different directions toward different individual screens. Gathered in the same room, facing the same direction, listening to the same thing at the same time. Your mother might be knitting or mending while she listened, your father might be reading the paper with part of his attention on the program, but you were all there, all present, all sharing the same experience at the same time. And here is the thing that no one who grew up after television can fully understand. Your imagination did the work the screen would later do for everyone else. When you heard a radio drama, you built the faces of the characters yourself, entirely, from scratch, from the sound of their voices and the description in the script, and whatever your own experience and imagination supplied. You built the rooms they moved through, the weather outside their windows, the expression on a face that the voice was describing but that you could not see. You were not given a picture. You were given the materials and trusted implicitly, without anyone framing it this way, to construct one. Every listener constructed a slightly different version of the same story. Every family sitting around their radio on a Tuesday evening was watching, in the private theater of their own imagination, a slightly different version of the same program. This was not a limitation. It was an act of profound creative collaboration between the storyteller and the audience, one in which the audience was not passive but active, not receiving but creating. That nightly exercise in mental construction, done casually, as entertainment, as something you did while your mother mended and your father read the paper, built something in you that cannot be acquired any other way. An inner visual world of extraordinary depth and detail, a capacity for imagination that does not require external input to activate, a habit of mental creation that is so deeply installed that it still runs, still generates, still fills silence and empty space with images and stories and possibilities that come from inside rather than from a screen. And then the television arrived. Think about the first time you saw one. Maybe it was at a neighbor's house, a family that got one before yours did, and you stood in their living room with other neighborhood children and watched the small gray screen with an attention that was itself a kind of wonder. Not at the content necessarily, but at the fact of the thing. The fact that there were moving pictures in a box in someone's living room in your neighborhood. The screen was small. The image was gray and slightly soft. Not fully resolved, not the hard-edged clarity that would come later. The rabbit ears that sat on top needed to be adjusted, moved by fractions of an inch in different directions, while someone stood in front of the set and watched the picture sharpen or blur, calling out there, "Stop, go back a little." Left. No, the other left. There were 2 or 3 channels depending on where you lived, and there was a schedule, a printed schedule in the newspaper, and the schedule was what determined what you watched because there was no other option. If you missed a program, you missed it. There was no recording, no replay, no streaming it later. It aired once, maybe twice if it was rerun in the summer, and if you were not in front of the television at the correct moment on the correct evening, that program was gone from your life forever. This created a relationship with television that was fundamentally different from the relationship anyone under 40 has ever had with it. It was appointment viewing, in the most literal sense. You made an appointment with a specific piece of cultural experience, and you either kept the appointment or you didn't, and if you didn't, it was simply over. You didn't think of television as entertainment on demand. You thought of it as an event, something that happened at a specific time, that you planned around, that you talked about in advance and afterward, that you experienced as a family in the same room with the same attention. You watched I Love Lucy in the same room as your parents, and you laughed at the same moments. You watched The Ed Sullivan Show and discussed afterward whether the act that had just appeared was as good as the one from last week. You watched the news together, the same anchor's voice, the same face, the same map, with the same markers that everyone in the country with a television was watching simultaneously, and the world as reported entered all of your living rooms through the same door at the same time. There was a shared reality to daily life that was so pervasive it was invisible. You didn't know that everyone having the same information, the same cultural reference points, the same nightly anchor to the shared story of what was happening in the world was unusual. You couldn't know because you had no basis for comparison. It simply was the way things worked. You didn't know it was special. You only learned that when it ended. The economy of enough. Here's something that almost nobody born after 1970 fully understands. You grew up in a time when enough was a real concept, not a spiritual aspiration or a minimalist lifestyle choice or a countercultural reaction to consumerism. A practical, operational description of a state that was genuinely satisfying and that did not require supplementation. You had enough. The house was enough. The car was enough. The food on the table was enough. And enough was not a disappointment. It was an achievement. It was what you worked for, and when you reached it, what you were grateful for. Your parents had come out of the Depression with a cellular memory of scarcity that had not faded simply because the scarcity had ended. They remembered in their bodies, in their habits, in their automatic responses to situations involving food or money or objects, what it felt like when there was not enough. And that memory had taught them things about the nature of objects and their value that prosperity did not erase. They didn't throw things away. They repaired them. A torn garment was mended. A broken appliance was examined to see if it could be fixed. A piece of furniture that was worn was reupholstered, not replaced. The default assumption about an object that was no longer functioning perfectly was that something could be done about it, that the problem was identifiable and the solution was within reach of someone willing to apply attention and effort. They saved the wrapping paper from Christmas presents carefully, separating the tape from the paper so the paper came off whole, folding it along its original creases, putting it in a box to be used again. They used every part of the chicken. They kept a jar of saved buttons in the sewing room because someday a button would be needed and there would be the button, not purchased, not ordered, simply there, having been saved against the day it would be useful because throwing it away would have been throwing away a future moment of need. Nothing was waste. Everything was potential. The end of one thing was the beginning of something else. The tin can that became a planter, the worn-out sheet that was cut into rags for cleaning, the vegetable scraps that went into the stock pot, because there was perfectly good nutrition in vegetable scraps, and throwing them away would have been a small absurdity. You learned to make do. Not as a virtue you were taught to perform, not as an identity you adopted, but as a basic operating principle of daily life, absorbed so completely and so early that it became indistinguishable from common sense. The jacket was worn until it couldn't be mended anymore, and then it became a work jacket, worn in the yard or the garage, until it couldn't serve even that function. And then it became rags. The shoes were resoled. The car was kept running by a man who understood every part of what was under that hood and had the tools hanging on a pegboard in the garage to address each one. You didn't buy. You maintained. That relationship with objects created a particular psychology around ownership that is now so rare it sometimes reads as eccentricity. You didn't own things lightly. Acquiring something was a decision, not an impulse. When you had something, you took care of it because taking care of things was what you did with things you owned. When something broke, your first instinct was to fix it, not because you couldn't afford a replacement, but because the calculus of replacing versus repairing was weighted by a value system that was not purely economic. You understood, at a level so deep it's almost physical, that objects represent labor, and labor represents life, and you don't throw your life away. That instinct is still in you, and it is still running. It's why you keep things that still work, even when a newer version exists. It's why replacing something that can be repaired feels like a small moral failure, a tiny act of wastefulness that leaves a faint residue of something like guilt. It's why you feel something close to revulsion when you see a culture of disposability treating the products of human labor things someone designed and manufactured and transported and sold, as objects with planned obsolescence, as things whose purpose was never to last, but to be replaced by the next version within a scheduled timeline. You were built in a world that respected the thing it took effort to make. And that respect doesn't expire. Sunday and what it held. Sunday was different from every other day of the week in a way that was physical, not just conventional. You could feel it. You knew it before you opened your eyes. Something in the quality of the morning light, which seemed to arrive at a different angle on Sundays. Or perhaps you simply had time to notice it, because the pace of Sunday permitted noticing. Something in the silence of the house, a different quality of silence than the silence of other mornings. A silence that was deliberate rather than accidental, that was maintained rather than simply present. Something in the smell from the kitchen, something already cooking at an hour when on weekdays the kitchen had barely woken up. This was not a regular day. Every sense told you so before any conscious thought confirmed it. You put on the clothes you didn't wear any other day. This was itself a ritual. The Sunday clothes, a category of clothing that existed entirely outside the daily wardrobe, that was cleaner and more formal, and that carried a different posture, a different way of moving through the world. You walked out of the house wearing these clothes, and you knew, and everyone you encountered knew, that today was set apart. You sat in a pew among people who had been sitting in that same pew in the same positions for longer than you had been alive. The family that sat in front of yours had been sitting in front of yours since your parents were children. The priest or the minister or the rabbi who stood at the front had known your parents when they were your age. The ritual was identical every week, every month, every year. The same words, the same responses that you knew before you could read, learned by repetition, absorbed through your skin. The same organ notes that announced the same moments in the same service in the same way they had always announced them and would always announce them. And something in that repetition, that identical ceremony performed week after week with the same community, did something to your brain that no amount of variety or novelty or individualized experience could replicate. It gave you a framework for time that was larger than a single life. You learned, in the most experiential possible way, that you were part of something that existed before you were born and would continue after you died. That the words you were saying in that pew had been said by people in your family going back further than memory could reach, that the same responses had been given by mouths that were now dust, that what you were doing on this Sunday morning was not a new thing, but a continuation of something ancient and ongoing and much larger than any individual story. That your story was a single thread in a cloth, being woven across generations. That the choices you made had weight not just for yourself, but for the fabric. That what you built, and what you believed and how you lived mattered beyond your own lifespan in ways that were real, even if they were invisible. That sense of continuity, of belonging to something larger than your own story, is one of the most profound psychological anchors a human being can have. It is one of the things that mental health researchers now identify as a central component of what they call meaning. The sense that your life connects to something beyond itself, that your existence participates in a story larger than the one that begins when you are born and ends when you die. You have that anchor. You have had it since childhood, installed through repetition, through community, through the weekly act of joining your voice to the voices of everyone around you, in words that have been spoken across centuries. It's why you think in terms of legacy, rather than just outcomes. Why you plant trees whose shade you know you'll never sit under, because the planting matters even if the sitting doesn't come. Why you do things for the generation after you without calculating the return, because the calculation was never the point. The point was the thread, and you're holding your end of it. You were built to think in long time. And long time is a dimension that the modern world is rapidly losing access to. The particular weight of work? Let's talk about work, because work in the 1950s meant something that it is slowly ceasing to mean. Work was not self-expression. It was not a platform or a brand or a vehicle for pursuing your passion. The question, "What are you passionate about?" would have made very little sense to most men and women of your parents' generation as a guide for career decisions, because career decisions were made on different grounds. Could you get the job? Did the job pay enough? Could you keep the job? Did the job have a pension? Work was the thing you did to make the life possible. It was the foundation, not the point. The point was the life, the family, the community, the things you built on top of the foundation. The foundation existed to support those things. A foundation that was strong and reliable was a good foundation. It didn't need to be interesting or fulfilling or aligned with your deepest values to be good. It needed to hold. You absorbed this understanding by watching the adults around you. Your father's relationship with his work was characterized not by enthusiasm or passion, but by something that in retrospect is more admirable than either: fidelity. He showed up. He did the job. He continued showing up and doing the job for years and decades without requiring the job to be more than it was or give him more than it gave. This is a psychological relationship with work that has been both lost and criticized in subsequent generations. But it produced something that the pursuit of passion does not always produce: stability. The slow accumulation of skill and seniority and trust that comes from staying in one place long enough to matter to it. A life whose structure could be counted on. You learned by watching this that commitment is its own reward, that the act of continuing, of showing up again after showing up yesterday and the day before, creates something that cannot be created in any other way. A depth of investment, a stake in the outcome, an identity that is built slowly, through time, through the accumulation of ordinary days. That lesson runs in you every time you do something you said you would do. Every time you stay when staying is harder than leaving. Every time you finish something you started, even when the starting seems long ago and the finishing is more work than you anticipated. You are acting out a philosophy that was installed before you could name it, that was demonstrated to you every morning when a man left a house at 5:30 and drove to a job and did the work and came home and did it again. The technology of human contact. Here's something worth sitting with. In your childhood, there was exactly one way to communicate with a human being in real time. You talked to them, in person or on the telephone, which was itself an object of such physicality and social complexity that using it was a skill, not a default. The phone was on the wall or on a table in a central location in the house, not in your room, not in your pocket, not a private instrument. It was a shared household resource, one line, one number, and using it meant potentially keeping everyone else in the household from using it, which meant that phone calls were made with an awareness of their cost, not just in money, though long distance was genuinely expensive, but in the social currency of household access. You memorized phone numbers, not as a deliberate act of memory training, but as a practical necessity. If you wanted to call someone, you had to know their number, which meant the numbers of the people who mattered to you were stored in your head, alongside everything else you knew about them. They were part of them. The 7 digits were as much a part of your mental representation of your best friend as the sound of their voice. When you called someone, you didn't know who would answer. This is a fact that anyone under 30 will struggle to fully imagine. The phone rang in a house, and whoever happened to be nearest to it, or whoever was assigned to answer it, picked up. You might intend to reach your friend and reach their father, who may or may not be someone you were comfortable speaking to, who may or may not be in a good mood, who represented a conversational challenge that you had to navigate competently before you could reach your actual destination. This meant that every phone call began with a social performance. You needed your polite voice, your clear diction, your ability to introduce yourself and state your purpose concisely to an adult who might not know you or might not remember you or might have opinions about how long their child spent on the phone with friends in the evening. You needed, in other words, a baseline of social competence that the act of calling required as an entry fee. You developed that competence because you had to, because there was no way around it, because the alternative was not communicating, and not communicating meant not knowing what was happening, not being part of the social fabric of your peer group, missing things. That early training in navigating social situations that were slightly uncomfortable, slightly uncertain, slightly outside your control, produced an adult who can walk into a room full of strangers and begin a conversation. An adult who can call someone they don't know well and make their purpose clear and be courteous and get what they need from the interaction. An adult who does not require a text interface to initiate human contact. Those skills are becoming rare, and you have them because you practiced them. Without knowing you were practicing them, every time you picked up the phone to call a friend and heard a parent's voice on the other end. Growing up before you were ready. There is something else about your childhood that is so fundamental that it is easy to overlook. Something that shapes almost every other aspect of the psychology we've been discussing. You were expected to become capable, and you were expected to become capable early, not pushed, not pressured, not enrolled in a program designed to accelerate your development, simply expected in the quiet way that expectations operate when they are not stated but simply assumed, to be able to handle things, to figure things out, to not require adult management of every situation you encountered. By the time you were 10, you were a person with a specific set of competencies that belonged to you. You could get yourself to school and back. You could manage your time well enough to meet the basic obligations of your daily life. You could be counted on to do the things you said you would do, or to have a genuine reason if you didn't. You were, in the language of an earlier era, responsible. This was not the result of a parenting philosophy. It was the result of a world that simply operated this way, that treated children as people in the process of becoming adult, rather than as fragile objects requiring managed development. The neighborhood expected things of you. The school expected things of you. The family expected things of you. And the accumulated weight of those expectations, consistent and clear and not contingent on how you felt about meeting them, produced a person who met them. The psychological consequence of this is something that researchers now call self-efficacy. The belief, grounded in experience, that you are capable of doing what needs to be done. Not confidence as a personality trait, not the performance of confidence that social media has turned into a commodity, but the quiet, deep, experience-based knowledge that you have handled things before and can handle them again. You have that. You have had it since you were old enough to walk to school alone, and it is, in the end, one of the most durable and useful things your childhood gave you. The thing about silence. There's one more thing that needs to be said. Something quiet and fundamental that underlies everything else we've discussed. You grew up before noise became the default state of being human. The house was quiet in the mornings, not the performing of quiet that happens now in spaces designated for silence, libraries, and meditation studios, and carefully curated calm. Just quiet, the natural state of a house before the day had fully started, before the devices had been turned on, before the world had been invited in through every possible channel. The street was quiet at night. When you lay in bed in summer with the window open, what you heard was the sound of the neighborhood itself, the crickets and the distant voices and the sound of a screen door somewhere down the block, and occasionally a car passing, and then the silence reasserting itself afterward, layering back in, complete. You were raised inside that silence, and you learned to live inside it rather than escape it. You learned that silence is not emptiness. It is not the absence of something. It is its own thing, its own quality of experience, with its own textures and colors and depths. It is the medium in which thought forms and memory surfaces, and the self becomes audible to itself, in which you hear the things you have been too busy to hear when the world was making noise. You learned that two people can sit on a porch for an hour without speaking a single word and be in deeper communication than most modern conversations achieve in 5 hours of text. You learned that shared silence is one of the most intimate things two people can offer each other. The willingness to simply be present without requiring anything to happen, without filling the space between them with noise to prove the relationship is active. You learned that the world doesn't need to be narrated, that experiencing something and simultaneously describing it for a potential audience are not compatible activities, that some experiences are diminished, not enhanced, by the attempt to capture them, that the act of living and the act of recording are different acts, and sometimes they cannot occupy the same moment. That capacity to simply be, without performing, without documenting, without commenting, without filling the air with proof of your existence, is the rarest human skill in the modern world. And you have it. You've always had it. Not because you chose it, but because you were built in a time when silence was still the natural condition of a life well lived. When the spaces between things were allowed to be spaces, not vacuums that needed to be filled. You carry that capacity into a world that has forgotten it was possible. Into meetings where everyone is simultaneously managing 3 other conversations on their phones. Into dinners where the food is photographed before it is tasted. Into a culture that has made productivity and stimulation and connection so constant that the people living inside it have lost access to the frequency at which their own thoughts broadcast. But you can still hear it. You can still find that frequency. It's why you sometimes turn off the radio on a long drive and drive in silence for an hour and arrive at your destination having thought something through that needed thinking through. It's why you can sit in a garden and simply sit, not reading, not listening, not producing anything, just present, just there, and find that this is not nothing. That it is, in fact, the opposite of nothing. You are not nostalgic. You are not stuck. You are not refusing to adapt to a world that has changed. You have adapted. You carry a smartphone. You use email. You have learned the new languages the world requires without forgetting the ones you already spoke. But underneath the adaptation, underneath the new skills and the new tools and the new ways of moving through a world that looks very little like the world that made you, you carry something that the world is only now beginning to understand it lost, the capacity to be fully present without a device in your hand, the capacity to trust a person because you looked them in the eye and your body told you something your mind then confirmed, the capacity to love something ordinary, a cup of coffee on a quiet morning, a neighbor's voice through an open window, an evening with nothing planned and nothing required, with the full weight of your attention rather than half of it, the capacity to wait, to not know and to continue anyway, to sit with a question that doesn't have an immediate answer and to live well in the meantime, to let time be what it is, slow in places, fast in others, always moving, always taking something with it, always leaving something behind, the capacity to carry the people you have loved and lost without a digital record to do the carrying for you, to keep them in the stories you tell, in the habits you formed because of them, in the way you do things the way they taught you to do, them even decades after they are gone. The capacity to understand, at the level of lived experience rather than theory, that a life is not a highlight reel, that it is made of ordinary days that look like nothing from the outside and contain everything on the inside, that what matters is almost never what gets photographed. The world didn't leave you behind. You arrived before it forgot what mattered, and you remember. You have always remembered. And in a world that is beginning, slowly, quietly, to realize what it has traded away, that memory is not an artifact. It is a gift.